What if the most famous face in history didn't in a lonely bedroom, but actually escaped to start a secret life as a mother? The official records of August 5th, 1962 tell a story of tragedy and a final lonely night in Brentwood, but the headlines were a carefully constructed veil. This is the untold story of the night Marilyn Monroe vanished to protect a daughter the world was never supposed to know existed. The golden light of a single candle danced across the nursery walls, a room the world was never meant to see. In the midnight quiet of Los Angeles, the air smelled of Chanel No. 5 and baby powder. This room, hidden behind a locked door, felt less like a home and more like a cage. Marilyn Monroe sat in a simple wooden rocking chair, but she didn't look like a movie star. There were no diamonds or silk gowns, just messy platinum hair and a tiny bundle cradled against her chest. This was her daughter, Rose, the industry's most dangerous secret. The studio executives had already given her an ultimatum in a meeting that felt like a trial. They pushed a contract across a mahogany desk, demanding of the baby to an anonymous agency. They claimed a child would ruin the blonde bombshell fantasy they sold to the public. They expected her to give up her daughter and return to the film set as if the last 9 months never happened. But looking at her sleeping baby, Marilyn didn't see a risk to her fame. She saw the only person who loved Norma Jean, not the icon. If you believe every child deserves that kind of unconditional love, hit the like button right now. For years, she had played the role of the girl who had everything and yet had nothing at all. Now, holding Rose, the loneliness that had followed her since the orphanages of her own youth finally began to lift. She knew what would happen if she stayed. The press would eventually sniff out the truth. The flashbulbs would blind this innocent child, and the same system that had chewed up her own spirit would begin to feast on her daughter. She reached for a single, weathered leather suitcase, the same one she had carried when she was just a girl with a dream, and began to pack. She didn't take the furs or the jewels. She took a few plain sweaters, a soft cotton blanket, and a silver rattle that she tucked deep into a hidden pocket. A rattle that reminded her of the only toy she'd ever clung to in foster care. That rattle, and the final whispered promise she made into the child's ear that night, would remain a secret for 70 years. A mystery that would only be solved when the very last box was opened. But as she reached for the nursery door, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. A shadow passed under the door, a studio guard who was never supposed to be on this floor. Marilyn held her breath, clutching Rose so tight she could hear her own heart thundering. If she was caught now, the escape wouldn't just be over. Rose would be taken before sunrise. She didn't just walk out the front door. She slipped through the service entrance like a ghost, wearing a dark wig and a trench coat to hide her famous face. Using a passport under the name Norma Miller, secretly secured months earlier, she hurried through Los Angeles International Airport. She wasn't just running from the studio. She was escaping Federal Bureau of Investigation files that remain redacted to this day, vanishing just hours before they was announced to the world. The heavy iron gates of a quiet cottage in Oxfordshire creaked shut, trading the roar of Hollywood for the morning mist of the English countryside. Here, the woman the world mourned as a star was quietly reborn as a mother. There were no red carpets, only the damp earth of a garden and the distant chime of a village church bell. In this sleepy hamlet, her platinum hair was hidden under a floral headscarf, and her famous curves were covered by thick wool sweaters. To the neighbors, she was just Mrs. Miller, a shy American widow pushing a baby carriage down dirt paths. No one suspected the woman buying eggs at the market was the same icon they saw on cinema screens. For the first time in 30 years, she felt she was exactly where she belonged. She spent her days nesting, but she remained careful. She hid her most important documents in a hollow beneath a loose stone near the hearth, just in case the world ever came looking for her. The change wasn't always easy. On quiet nights, the silence felt heavy compared to the noise of a film set. She would sit by the fire and wonder if the studio lawyers were still hunting for their lost investment. But when a whimper drifted from the nursery, she would hurry to Rose's side. In the dim light, she would sway and hum a lullaby, her famous husky voice now filled with real maternal tenderness instead of a performance. She found a simple joy in motherhood, learning to bake bread with flour-covered hands and planting real roses that actually bloomed. She realized the Marilyn the world loved was just a character she built to survive. Here, in a drafty cottage, Norma Jean was finally for the little girl who called her Mama. It was a quiet victory, shared only by the stars and the ancient oaks guarding her home. Yet, even in this paradise, the shadows of the past had a way of stretching long across the Atlantic. Marilyn didn't know that 5,000 miles away, the hunt had never truly stopped. It had simply gone underground. A private investigator was staring at a grainy photograph taken at the local village market. He zoomed in on a small, distinctive mole near the woman's lip. The investigator knew about the secret $5 million bounty the studio had placed on her return, a king's ransom for the return of their missing property. If you had to choose between fame and a secret happy life, what would you pick? Tell us in the comments. A single hand-dripped beeswax candle flickered atop a lumpy strawberry cupcake, casting a warm, amber glow across a kitchen table that had seen a lifetime of secrets in just 12 short months. Outside, the Oxfordshire wind whistled through the eaves of the cottage, but inside, the air was still and sweet, vibrating with the soft, melodic humming of a woman who had finally found her song. It was a milestone the world would never record in any biography. Yet for the woman sitting in that humble wooden chair, it was the greatest premiere of her entire life. Marilyn leaned forward, her face radiant in the candlelight, as she watched 1-year-old Rose reach out with a chubby, curious hand toward the tiny flame. This was the first birthday, a day Marilyn had once feared she would never see as a mother, and every second of it felt like a miracle she had stolen from the clutches of a cruel destiny. She reached out and gently guided her daughter's hand away from the heat, marveling at the soft silkiness of the toddler's skin. In that moment, the gold statues, the roaring ovations of New York City, and the flashing bulbs of the premiere nights felt like they belonged to a different person in a different universe. They were hollow shadows compared to the solid, breathing reality of the child sitting before her. As Rose let out a sudden, bubbling giggle that echoed against the low timber beams of the ceiling, Marilyn felt a lump form in her throat that no amount of Hollywood training could suppress. She remembered the lonely birthdays of her own youth, the cold rooms of foster homes where she had blown out imaginary candles and whispered wishes to a God she wasn't sure was listening. She had promised herself that if she ever brought a soul into this world, that child would never know the sting of being unwanted. Looking at Rose, whose bright blue eyes were filled with nothing but absolute trust and unconditional love, Marilyn knew she had kept that promise. She had traded the fame that made her an icon for the love that made her a human being. She picked up a small silver spoon and offered a bit of frosting to the birthday girl, laughing as Rose wrinkled her nose and smeared the pink cream across her rosy cheeks. There were no photographers here to capture the perfect angle, no directors shouting for more emotion, and no producers counting the minutes. There was only a mother and her daughter, bound together by a secret that was as beautiful as it was fragile. Marilyn took a deep breath, the scent of vanilla and wood smoke filling her lungs, and for the first time in years, the crushing anxiety that had once defined her existence was nowhere to be found. But as the candle finally sputtered and leaving the room in the soft twilight of an English evening, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept into the kitchen. Marilyn reached for the window latch to close out the cold, but her hand froze. A pair of headlights was cutting through the fog at the edge of the lane, headlights that moved too slowly, as if searching for a specific house. The low, rhythmic growl of an engine that did not belong to a farm tractor vibrated through the quiet Oxfordshire air, shattering the morning peace of the cottage garden. At the end of the narrow dirt lane, a sleek black sedan sat idling like a predatory beast, its polished chrome catching the sun in a way that felt like a violent intrusion. Behind the wheel, a man in a sharp fedora adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes fixed on the modest stone house, where a woman was currently hanging white cotton sheets on a clothesline, unaware that the shadow of her former life had finally caught up to her. Marilyn felt the hair on her neck rise before she even turned around. It was a sensation she knew from 1,000 crowded streets, the feeling of being hunted by a lens. When she finally looked toward the gate, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The man stepped out of the car, carrying a leather briefcase and a heavy black camera that looked like a weapon. He was an investigator from 20th Century Fox, a man whose job it was to find the studio's missing property and bring it back to the assembly line. He didn't call her Mrs. Miller. He called her by the name that felt like a shroud. He told her the studio was tired of the games and that they knew about the child. He opened the briefcase to reveal a new contract, the numbers written in ink that looked like blood. $5 million for 3 pictures, a king's ransom that could buy a dozen estates. But there was a condition. The child would have to be handled discreetly, kept in a boarding school far from the set. They were offering her the world, but the price was the soul of her daughter. As the man spoke, a sudden movement caught Marilyn's eye. A local village boy on a bicycle, slowing down to stare at the expensive car and the strange man. For a heart-stopping moment, the investigator turned his camera toward the boy, as if considering using the locals to spark a scandal that would flush her out. Marilyn stepped between the lens and the village, her body a physical shield. She took the contract from his hand, and without a single word, she tore it into a dozen white scraps, letting them fall into the dirt like discarded petals. She told him to leave and never come back. She told him that Marilyn Monroe was, and that the woman standing before him had something far more valuable than a movie career. The man got back into his car and drove away, but as the dust settled, Marilyn saw something he had dropped in the dirt. It wasn't a business card. It was a photograph of Joe DiMaggio, her ex-husband, leaving his home in New York with a suitcase. The investigator hadn't just found her. He was using the one man she still trusted to lure her back. The scratch of a fountain pen against thick, cream-colored stationery was the only sound in the cottage as the moon climbed high over the English oaks. Marilyn sat at her small writing desk, the ink still wet on a letter addressed to the one man who had truly tried to protect her, Joe DiMaggio. She began the letter as a woman who had finally found her footing. She wrote about the way the light hit the hills of Oxfordshire at dawn, and how the air smelled of rain and wild lavender, far removed from the smog of California. But the heart of the letter was about Rose. She described her daughter's laughter and the way the little girl had inherited a stubborn streak that reminded Marilyn of Joe. She confessed that she had chosen to become a ghost so that her daughter could become a person. Marilyn poured her soul onto the page, explaining the encounter with the investigator and the fear that had taken root in her garden. She told Joe she needed a guardian who lived outside the reach of the Hollywood machine, someone who could fight the shadows that her fame had invited. She wasn't asking for money. She was asking for his silence and his strength. Just as she was finishing the final lines, the sound of a heavy knock at the front door made her jump, nearly knocking the inkwell over. Her heart raced. Had the investigator returned? She scrambled to hide the letter beneath a stack of old recipes, her hands shaking as she moved toward the door. It turned out to be only a neighbor delivering a basket of late summer apples, but the terror of that moment lingered long after the neighbor had left. She realized how close she had come to exposing her only lifeline. Marilyn went back to the desk, her heart still thumping against her ribs. She signed her name, not the one that graced the marquise, but her real name, and a single tear fell, blurring the ink on the final line. She was inviting him into the secret circle of her life, trusting him with the only thing that mattered more to her than her own breath. She folded the paper carefully, sealing it with wax and a prayer. But as she walked to the post office the next morning, she noticed the black sedan wasn't gone. It was parked 2 blocks away, its engine off, waiting to see exactly where she was sending that letter. If she dropped it in the box now, she might be handing Joe over to the same wolves that were hunting her. This story of survival is just beginning. Share this with one person who loves classic Hollywood secrets. The dust motes danced in the afternoon sun that filtered through the tiny circular window of the cottage attic, illuminating a scene of quiet, accidental discovery. 7-year-old Rose stood amidst the cobwebs and old trunks, her eyes wide with wonder as she clutched a handful of something that shimmered like a fallen star. It was a gown of white silk and hand-sewn sequins, a relic from a world of glamour that had been buried for nearly a decade. Marilyn had been in the garden when she realized the house had grown far too quiet. She climbed the narrow wooden stairs, finding Rose sitting on the floor, surrounded by movie posters and glossy black and white photographs of a woman with a dazzling, breathy smile. Rose looked up and asked in a small, confused voice if this was the lady who lived in the trunk, and why she looked so much like the woman who made her oatmeal every morning. The weight of the secret Marilyn had carried for 7 years suddenly felt like a mountain. She sat down on the dusty floorboards, pulling Rose into her lap. But instead of the hug she expected, Rose pushed away slightly, her young face clouded with a sudden, sharp mistrust. "Are you a liar, Mama?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is everything a story?" That question cut deeper than any studio contract ever could. Marilyn realized that by protecting Rose from the world, She had accidentally created a wall between them. She didn't try to hide the photographs. Instead, she looked at the image of Marilyn and began to explain that once upon a time she had played a role because she thought that was the only way to be loved. She told Rose about the beautiful princess who lived in a castle of glass, but who was secretly very lonely and very cold. She told her daughter that the princess had decided to because she had found a treasure far more precious than gold. She looked directly into Rose's blue eyes and told her that she had traded the glittering dress for a simple life because she wanted to be a mommy more than she wanted to be a legend. Slowly, the tension left Rose's small body. She reached out and wiped a tear from Marilyn's face, saying that she liked the mommy who wore sweaters much better than the lady in the picture, because the mommy who wore sweaters was real. In that moment of honesty, the ghost of Marilyn Monroe was replaced by the strength of Norma Jean. But as they packed the dresses back into the trunk, Rose pulled out one more thing from the bottom. A small silver key Marilyn had forgotten was there. "What does this open, Mama?" Rose asked. Marilyn's breath hitched. That key opened a safe deposit box in London, one that contained the only proof that the woman the world called Marilyn Monroe was officially, legally, no longer among the living. The porcelain teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone floor of the kitchen with a sound that felt far too loud in the morning stillness. Marilyn leaned heavily against the oak table, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches as a wave of exhaustion washed over her, a weariness that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep and everything to do with a body that was beginning to reach its natural conclusion. For years, she had been the sun in her daughter's universe, but as the first leaves of autumn began to turn gold, she realized her own light was starting to flicker. She knew the doctors in the village would speak of a heart that had simply grown tired, but Marilyn understood the truth. She had spent every ounce of her spirit ensuring that her daughter could grow up in a world of safety. She had fought the studios, the press, and the crushing weight of her own legend, and now, at the age of 56, the physical cost was coming due. She didn't feel fear. She felt a profound, aching urgency to prepare Rose for a world where she would have to stand on her own. As Rose, now a young woman of 18, came into the kitchen, she saw the paleness of Marilyn's face and immediately knelt by her side. Marilyn reached out, stroking her daughter's cheek, memorizing every line of a face she had cherished since the moment of birth. She spoke in a voice that was thin but filled with a depth of love that no microphone could capture, telling Rose that the greatest role she had ever played wasn't on a screen, but in this house. She explained that she had no regrets about the life she had left behind, because every movie she had ever made was just a shadow, compared to the living, breathing miracle of her daughter's future. Marilyn began to make the final arrangements, contacting the trusted lawyers and the silent friends in America who had kept her secret for over 2 decades. She was meticulous, ensuring that the trust funds were secure and that the cottage would remain a sanctuary. She was weaving a safety net out of the remnants of her fame, transforming the wealth she had once despised into a shield that would protect Rose long after Marilyn was present. As the sun set behind the Oxfordshire hills, casting long violet shadows across the garden, Marilyn sat in her rocking chair, watching Rose walk through the orchard. She felt a strange, peaceful, a sense that her mission was complete. She had taken a girl who was meant to be a tragic headline and turned her into a woman who was free, loved, and whole. Marilyn's eyes closed for the final time, but as her hand went limp, it brushed against a small hidden lever under the arm of the chair. A hidden compartment clicked open, revealing a stack of letters, all of them returned and unopened. They were the letters she had sent to Joe DiMaggio. He had never received them. It wasn't an accident. Someone, perhaps the studio or an even darker shadow like the Secret Service, had been intercepting her only lifeline for 20 years, keeping them both in a prison of silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 18 slow, resonant chimes, each one echoing through the quiet rooms like a heartbeat counting down to a moment of total transformation. In the center of the parlor, a young woman sat alone with a heavy, wax-sealed envelope resting in her lap. This was the threshold between the girl who had grown up in the dappled sunlight of Oxfordshire and the woman who was about to inherit the weight of the most famous name in history. Rose felt her fingers tremble as she broke the seal, the scent of lavender and old paper rising from the pages. Inside was a letter, written in her mother's elegant, looping script, a final conversation from beyond the veil. Marilyn had written these words, knowing she would not be there to see the look on her daughter's face. The letter began not with the name of a star, but with a simple confession. I gave up the world so I could have you, and it was the only thing I ever did that was truly right. As Rose read on, the quiet cottage seemed to fill with the echoes of 1,000 flashbulbs and the roar of 1,000,000 voices calling out for a woman they never really knew. Marilyn detailed the deals she had broken and the fortune she had walked away from, explaining that the studio had demanded she choose between being a legend and being a mother. She wrote of the nights she had spent terrified that the world would find them, and the fierce, burning pride she felt every time she looked at Rose and saw a child who was free from the hunger of the public eye. I wanted you to have a name that was your own, Marilyn wrote, not a name that belonged to the billboards. The most powerful revelation came at the very end of the letter, where Marilyn described the quiet peace she had found in their hidden life. She admitted that for years she had felt like a hollow shell, filled with other people's dreams, but that the first time she held Rose, she finally felt solid. She told her daughter that she was the only real thing in a life made of celluloid and shadows. Rose clutched the paper to her chest, her tears blurring the ink of the final sentence. Do not be sad that the world lost a star, because I found my soul in you. In that small parlor, the legend of Marilyn Monroe was finally stripped of its tragedy and replaced by the triumph of a mother's choice. But as Rose folded the letter, she noticed the postscript on the very back of the last page, written in a different, hurried hand. If you're reading this, go to the cellar. Under the third loose stone from the hearth, there is a second letter. It's from Joe. He found out the truth the day before he departed this life. Rose's heart stopped. She remembered seeing her mother staring at that hearth for years. The story wasn't over. It was just becoming a legacy. The sun beat down with a relentless golden intensity on the manicured lawns of Westwood Village Memorial Park, a stark contrast to the soft grey mists of the English countryside that Rose had left behind. She stood before a small, unassuming marble crypt, her simple cotton trench coat looking out of place among the tourists who gathered nearby with their cameras and their hushed whispers. For the rest of the world, this cold stone was the final resting place of a tragic blonde goddess who had two young. But for the woman standing there with a single red rose in her hand, the truth was much warmer and infinitely more beautiful. Rose watched as a group of fans laid bouquets of lilies at the base of the plaque, weeping for a woman they had only ever seen on a screen. It was a strange, surreal experience to realize that the person they were crying for was not the woman who had tucked her into bed every night for 18 years. They were mourning a symbol, while Rose carried the memory of a mother who smelled of flower and garden soil, who had silver gray hair by the end, and who had laughed until she cried over burnt toast in a drafty kitchen in Oxfordshire. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of protectiveness, a desire to shout to the crowd that their tragedy was a lie, that Marilyn Monroe hadn't in 1962, but had instead found the courage to disappear so she could live. But as she looked at the name on the crypt, she felt her mother's presence in the warm California breeze, a gentle reminder of the promise they had kept. To reveal the secret now would be to invite the very chaos her mother had to escape. The silence was the greatest gift they had shared, a sacred pact that had allowed one small girl to grow up without the weight of the world's expectations. Rose stepped forward when the crowd thinned, placing her single rose against the cool marble. She closed her eyes and whispered a thank you that was decades in the making, a message intended for the woman who had walked away from the diamonds to ensure her daughter would never know the coldness of an orphanage. She realized that while the world possessed the legend, she possessed the truth. And that truth was a far more magnificent story than any script ever written in this city of dreams. As she walked away from the crypt, a man in a grey suit stepped out from behind a monument. He didn't look like a fan. He looked exactly like the investigator from her mother's story, only 30 years older. He handed her a small, tarnished silver rattle, the same one her mother had packed in that leather suitcase so many decades ago. "Your mother dropped this in 1962, he whispered. "I've been waiting for you to come back and claim it." The soft, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair echoed through the same Oxfordshire nursery where the journey had begun, a sound that felt like the steady ticking of a heart that refused to forget. Outside the window, the ancient oak stood tall against a twilight sky of bruised purple and soft gold, guarding the secrets of a cottage that had once sheltered the most famous woman on earth. Inside, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes the color of a summer sea sat cradling a new life, whispering a melody that had traveled across oceans and through decades of silence to reach this very moment. Rose was no longer the curious girl in the attic. She was a grandmother now, and as she looked down at the infant in her arms, she saw the unmistakable spark of a legacy that had nothing to do with fame. Her mother, the woman the world knew as Marilyn, had walked away from the glittering heights of the mountain to plant a garden in the valley. And as Rose felt the warmth of her grandchild against her chest, she knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. The cycle of neglect that had haunted her mother's own childhood had been broken by the sheer force of a maternal will. Rose looked over at the small side table where a silver rattle sat, the same one Marilyn had packed in a suitcase 70 years ago, and the one returned to her at the cemetery. Beside it lay the Rolex watch that Joe DiMaggio had intended for his daughter, its steady ticking a rhythmic reminder of the honor that had protected them. She reached out and touched the rattle, remembering the final whispered promise her mother had made in that Los Angeles nursery. A promise to give her a life that was real. Rose realized that while the world continued to chase the blonde bombshell, her mother had achieved something far more legendary. She had become a ghost so that her children could become people. She thought of the white silk dress in the trunk and the perfumes of the past, but they were just artifacts. The real inheritance was the sound of the rocking chair and the safety of the Oxfordshire walls. As the baby let out a tiny, contented sigh, Rose leaned down and whispered the same lullaby her mother had sung to her during those long-ago winters. She told the sleeping child about a brave woman who had turned her back on the sun so that her daughter would never be burned by its heat. She realized that the Marilyn the world mourned was just a character, but the woman who had lived in this cottage was an eternal flame that would never as long as this family remained whole. The stars began to peek through the branches of the oaks, shining down on a house that remained a sanctuary of peace. The world would continue to search for answers in old film reels, never realizing that the answer was right here, in the quiet breath of a child and the enduring strength of a daughter's memory. The story of Marilyn Monroe didn't flourish in the heart of an English wood where a mother's love had rewritten the stars. If Marilyn's secret sacrifice moved you, hit the like button to honor her courage. To join our community for more untold histories and hidden legacies, make sure to subscribe before you go.